Hi, this is Forrest Lightberg with the Santa Barbara Response Network. I'm here with Gina Carvalho once again, who is the co-founder of the Santa Barbara Response Network. Today's topic for this broadcast, again, is racial inequality and healing. And today we have a very special guest named Frank Rodriguez. Now I'm going to introduce him in a moment, but I want to just say hello to Gina for a moment. Gina, thanks very much for helping facilitate this and providing this for the communities for so long and so often.
I apologize, my internet is wonky, but I want to have a series of dialogues, local, in our community, upfront about all of this that we're seeing on media in our nation about race and people stepping up, and a lot of activity, a lot of movement, a lot of energy, and a lot of opportunity to change a lot of systems and to move forward. And Frank can, I believe, add a very valuable perspective to how we, from each of our own communities, immigrant and otherwise, how can we be part of that change and that conversation? So thank you, Frank, for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So Frank is a powerful advocate and voice for a marginalized community of predominantly people of color. He works with CAUSE, which is the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy. It's a grassroots nonprofit dedicated to empowering social, economic, and environmental justice. Frank, I want to welcome you to our broadcast.
Thanks for having me today. And I'm glad to participate, and you heard pieces of Julia and David, Reverend Julia Hamilton and Pastor David Moore last week, and glad to continue this conversation. And I think we continue to elevate the leadership of Black women and women of color that have been being pushed here in Santa Barbara, particularly Black women. And I think there's a lot of momentum and hope to continue to elevate that and call out how we, especially as within the Latino community, and myself being a light-skinned, tall Latino, kind of the complicity and anti-Black that we see in our community, and excited to engage in that conversation for community healing, because we do need to be in this together. So I'm glad to be able to have this critical conversation with you all today.
Absolutely. Well, it's our pleasure to have you here, of course. So, you know, obviously we've all been very disturbed and pained and angered by what we've seen happen last week, last Monday in Minneapolis, and just the ensuing response across the country and countries around the world have been very, I mean, it seems it all just happened in such a short period of time. It's so unexpected for all of that to happen, especially in the face of the COVID pandemics and the quarantines and lockdowns. So I just want to ask you what you're seeing as it pertains to Santa Barbara County in particular, or possibly also Ventura County. I believe is CAUSE based in Ventura County.
Yeah. Yes, we have offices in Santa Maria, Santa Barbara, Santa Paula, Ventura, and Oxnard. So we're spread out throughout the region. And one could talk about what's in my mind, and a big piece is CAUSE and a lot of different organizations are part of an infrastructure institutions that have been supporting Latinx communities, immigrant communities, Spanish-speaking communities here in the region. Since it was founded out of the living wage campaigns that launched in early 2000s. And so I really feel kind of that presence, and especially that institution of support for a lot of the communities, and kind of just in terms of how much we've been seeing kind of that institutional presence and that institutional reaction from electeds, but just from society in general, in terms of supporting our Black community, our Asian community, stuff that has been coming up on our health task force, and in a real way in terms of how do we, and this is talking about being complicit in these efforts in terms of how to not be there for especially our Black community. And one piece that that I really appreciated from the list of the bands that you all talked about last time with Reverend Julia Hamilton and Pastor David Moore. I really feel right now elevating the piece of renaming the Franklin Community Center, which is in the Santa Barbara East Side, a community I grew up in. I grew up in Voluntario Street, another piece I grew up here in Santa Barbara. Moved around in Carpinteria, Isla Vista, Santa Barbara, as my parents moved around all over the place. But my time was in Voluntario Street as I attended Franklin and Elementary and Cleveland Elementary. And so I loved the conversation last week and talking about the redlining. The Santa Barbara started, first recognizing it is Chumash territory, and recognizing that the history of indigenous folks in this region, of course. But as colonization came through, it has been a place of separation and segregation that was mentioned last time. And that for me has been a beautiful, thought out, and showing the strong leadership of Black women right now in terms of taking that task for us to look at our own communities, right? And I grew up knowing that and learning more and more of the gentrification that pushed out Black community in the 80s and around that time. So it's being intentional of learning that history. And I think a lot of, there could be a lot of weight in reflecting on how much we have not done as a community, as a society, and we know this is institutional, but how much we as individuals can take this as a blessing, right? As this leadership is blessing us with ways in order to move forward and reflect. Totally agree with everything we can get into. How do we get more into community policing rather than intimidation and a type of enforcement that is not there, as the protest showed on Sunday, sorry. So I am really finding encouragement in looking and reflecting on that in action by making sure that is fury and energy and empowerment to empower our community, which is Black persons in our community.
Sure. Gina, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Frank, yeah, I wanted to ask Frank if he had seen the Board of Supervisors meeting last night, where I think there was a tremendous amount of support, solidarity, and action. I think the mayor also has made some statements. I know the chief of police has. How is that resonating with you, witnessing all of that happening in our community?
Yeah, I think again, centering the of course Simone, we need to make sure that that the pieces that Black women are putting forward, and sorry, I was meant to say Simone and Crystal and other Black women, and especially a strong crew of women of color that have been supporting. I think it's that energy is moving our community. It's something that we need to keep our ear on. And I extremely appreciate all the momentum, but think that as we move for institutional change, especially, like I said, myself as a Latino male, like really looking at as a reflection of how to make sure we center by listening to Black voices through this process. So I appreciate listening to and Das William, Supervisor Das William and Greg Hart. I appreciate their statement and saying they're going to be intentional and listen, and supporting Juneteenth, which is institutionalizing our remembrance of really supporting a Black community, which I super appreciate. But I know my ears are going to be closer in following the leadership of Black women right now in the work I do, and the work I do to work with myself, right? And another big piece I did want to bring was especially with our Latino community, and really hearing a lot in terms of kind of basically getting to the point like saying like, oh, what about us, right? What about the hurt that we've seen in our Latino community? And I don't think it's a but. It's definitely a yes and. It's really I reflect on my interactions and my family's interactions with the police department, but don't feel like that's the stories that need to be elevated right now. It's how do we make sure we are listening, and like again, this is a huge blessing in order to the call to action from Black Lives Matter Santa Barbara is super clear, super direct, and many different ways to not only push on our police department in order to be more compassionate in their work, but it's also as our community, how do we be more compassionate to the Black community here in Santa Barbara? And so I feel a lot of empowerment in that, and want to make sure that as I move forward, really elevate those pieces, and really work with our Spanish-speaking community on these conversations. As cause, we definitely have had long meetings discussing and outlining how to have these conversations and with our communities to make sure that we're not going to continue in silence. And these conversations have happened before, but how do we be more intentional in institutionalizing them, and not be complicit in erasing the voices of Black people? So I think that's something that we're committed to, but of course that has to be done in action more than anything. So I think that's what we're working towards.
What I like to see now is that this conversation has been brought to the forefront of in so many families, relationships, communities, that if there's any silver lining here, that conversation can lead to the type of action that you're speaking to. And of course, it seems that bold action has always been preceded by some conversation or dialogue. And so I want to ask you, you mentioned Black Lives Matters calls to action, which were very clear and very so clear and so well written. And it seems like local leadership is really listening to those calls to action. Now, what do you see as some other effective strategies that our community can potentially adopt or consider adopting, or bring to our local leadership and propose adopting to continue to address racism, systemic racism, etc.?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be going back to, like, we need to listen to the leadership from Black people that is happening right now, and making sure they lead this conversation, and are put in positions to be able to lead this conversation, because in different spaces, even that I have been, I haven't been that model, or haven't been that. And I think whatever I can say right now is specifically of what I'm going to be doing to outreach to the Spanish-speaking community that I'm a part of, and make sure that that these conversations that are happening, one, that they get information, that they understand all, that they understand the platform, why there's the push on the police department, on a civilian review board, on the sheriff's department, on the renaming of of and remembering the founders of places here in Santa Barbara, institutions here in Santa Barbara. So I think for me, it's really having that dialogue. And like I said, I've been hearing or seeing in social media, I'm hearing in different spaces. I mean, in our city council meeting, it happened as well, where there's a response from the Latino community about what about us? What about our issues? And I think that's we're here. We need to be here in community and remember that the reason we say Black Lives Matter is because of the history that we have here in the United States, and the history that has been put on Black people here. So I think it's really taking a step back. Not, I think as a person that I have reflected and been authentically brought in to reflect on is how myself as a person, I feel like I'm just doing work and helping my community, but I am in a lot of places of leadership, Molina and the health task force in that work, and just continue reflections of where I have not been there to really elevate that Black Lives Matter. And so I think it's a genuine reflection on my part that that needs to happen. And so I know what I really wanted to come here to kind of say like how to work with the Latinx community, immigrant community here in our region, because it's important and it's a community I can engage in. But in terms of what we push with our elected officials, with all that, I mean, it's me. I'm really understanding. I have a lot. I do have weight in terms of when I say things. So I really want to sit back and listen, like I said, to that that leadership that is coming, especially from Black women, and that's where my ears will be to.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Gina, did you want to
and
chime in?
I yes, I do. I definitely want to invite them to be here on our next conversation. I appreciate two things I appreciate, Frank, is that word listening, because we really have no idea until we listen what's been happening with Black lives in this country if we're not Black. We really have to listen, because there's so much misinformation that's been passed down. We have no idea, and there's so much we can educate ourselves on, so many books, so many things that have been written that we can understand the experience, that right now in our country, it's tearing our country apart. Racism, if we don't deal with it, it really is going to be an undoing of this democracy. And so I just want to keep the conversation going, and I want to listen and learn. When I was in Los Angeles, I spent a lot of time in Watts, and I worked with Father G, and I worked with other activists in Los Angeles. And when I came from Canada, I had no idea, really. I was innocent. This is my personal story about the extent of racism. And I was out with a man, a Black man, and our car broke down in part of Los Angeles. And he said, "Oh my God, we have to call the police." And I went, "Oh, no big deal." He goes, "Oh no, it's a big deal." And I looked at him like, and it was a big deal. Where'd you get the car? Who's this white woman? Who owns this car? What are you doing here? Get out of the car. We're talking 20 years ago. And this was a nice neighborhood, but it was late at night and it was a Porsche. Where'd you get this car? And I mean, those are little small things, but that's what we're living. That's the implicit racial prejudice, bias that happens. And if you're not, and I would recommend places to go. He goes, "I can't go there, I'm Black." What? So I learned, a little bit about that, but I'm not living it. So we have to listen to those people and those voices that have very intelligently set up ways that try to change this, and move it forward. So I appreciate that. And I'm going to invite them on our next, hopefully they'll come on Monday. Um, so, and I appreciate what you're saying, Frank, about how to talk to your community about what's going on. So we're all united.
Yeah, and I think it's going back to that piece of democracy. I think it's the way it's been here. It's worked to the way that those in power have wanted, as that phrase goes. In terms of the system is working the way those in power want it, and I think when we look at what's going on right now, I think it's really reimagining a different world, right? In terms of how do we really get into that healing justice and really be communal. And so I think it's a good time right now in order to see how we can move forward with that. Sorry, Gina, go ahead.
No, I wanted to talk about trauma. Because when I was talking to my friends in Watts and in these areas where there's so much mass violence, he said, you know, we're all suffering from PTSD. We're all suffering from PTSD from birth onward. And because the Santa Barbara Response Network is dealing with trauma and in all its aspects, I wanted to just say that we have to be very mindful for our own selves, our families. These images, the image of someone being murdered in front of your eyes is not something that goes away. It keeps people up at night. That amount of brutality and vile anger directed toward a human being. So we have to be very careful about taking care of ourselves, moving forward, taking action, but also our psychological well-being and that of our community so that we can actually be very effective. We have to be centered. We have to take care of ourselves. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And I say take action. I'm totally behind all of that, but also keep that connection with ourselves so that we're not crippled by these horrendous images that we're seeing and minimizing some of that. So I just wanted to say that, and that people need to keep talking also for their own self-healing. They need to say the anger and the pain. So yeah. I just wanted to bring it back to the personal as well.
And like I was mentioning earlier, like especially for our Latino community in terms of our experiences with the police, how we bring that instance as a way to be in union, to be supporting our Black community, and really how we phrase things really means a lot. And erasing people really means a lot, right? And so I think it's how do we hold true what people have gone through, but at the same time, how do we make sure that that it's not belittling, it's not pushing back, it's not discrediting, it's not allowing us to move forward with supporting our Black community, which is at the forefront right now. So I really want to have, and I really want to see it as somebody that I feel like has kind of, I used my experiences that I've gone through to make sure that I'm elevating. And for me, growing up in the East Side, when I was put in a lineup when I was in elementary school by the SBPD, I know after that I couldn't, I wasn't outside as much. I was in the lower part of Voluntario Street, and I know that it was a lot of trauma, and my mom had to do a lot for me to hang out with the kids outside again. And so as someone in the East, we definitely have Black community, just seeing just what folks are going through. And so I really want to make sure that the experiences I have are I'm listening to them, Gina, right? Because that trauma is real. But how do I make sure I'm connecting it with the calls that are being happening right now? And folks, when folks feel like they want to respond back, hey, what about the Latino community? What about something we're hearing a lot about is like, what about fighting for the kids in cages? Because of course of all the with ICE out of California and fighting for the immigrant community. And I think it's especially Black women have been there with us, and folks have been put, but let's not use this divisive kind of rhetoric from moving forward with how we're going to heal our community, and that's by listening to Black women, and that's earlier I just said their first names and I didn't say their full names. I apologize for that. And it was Simone Baker and Crystal Farmer, and so I think it's how do we make sure we listen and put our ears there, and yeah, I think listening is a huge part. And so for our Latinx community is how do we listen and listen to our trauma, but at the same time we need to have our ears listening.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
So,
thank you.
We have just a few more minutes here, but I do want to ask you, again, do you have any more thoughts on how people who may not have, who may not be elected officials, how can people, besides what we can do for advocating for certain policies or laws or political actions, etc. What can people do in their lives, in their relationships, and in their communities on a personal level to contribute to this? It seems like there's racism exists in the minds of people as well as systemically. So I suppose I'm asking, how can we address the racism that exists in the minds of people and how that is expressed in our everyday life, or when opportunities come up, or just proactively? Do you have any ideas around that? And then, we only have a couple minutes here. I know that's a big question, but if you have a summary of what you would say to that, that might even be a great episode to do, Gina, about just that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, Frank, and then we'll close this out and start concluding this session here.
Yeah, I think the main thing that's sitting with me right now is how do we make sure this is a continual conversation. These issues, particularly in Santa Barbara, and anti-Blackness has been present in Santa Barbara City College, has been present in many different spaces, and so I think it's important for us to remember to continue having this conversation beyond a day, beyond a week, beyond a month. Like, how do we institutionalize this? And so, and I think that's what's the clearest point being pushed, is that we need policy change in order to make sure that this is institutionalized. And so I think as Cause, we hear that clearly as an organization that focuses on advocacy and specifically on policy change. I think that is where we would call on folks to push on elected officials to make sure that policy change happens. And as a person that loves history, I think it's how do we delve into that? So remembering the history of and the contributions of the Black community here in Santa Barbara. So I think it's kind of in that history, we can connect with the Chumash folks, Indigenous folks, with Latinx folks. So I think that's where looking at that history, that's where I find a lot of critical reflection that is necessary in order to tackle these difficult questions. When people, if we don't have that historical lens, we can't get critical, and people feel attacked. And so maybe that's the last point I'll put is the last thing is folks that are finding this being a difficult conversation, to not like, and I think Gina alluded it to earlier, to not be discouraged, to not be let down, but how to really find empowerment in looking to empower our community members and our community as a whole. For people not to be scared and discouraged from having these difficult conversations, because we need to find empowerment in empowering the Black community with them. And so I think those are kind of the main pieces that I'm taking away right now, Forrest.
Great.
Mhm.
Well, Gina, do you have any anything you'd like to share to that?
I think I really just appreciate Frank's very articulate and well-rounded. The conversation included so many aspects of our community. I really appreciated it, Frank, and I think there's a sense of knowing where to put the attention right now, and I appreciated that, and I'll take that lead and continue the conversation on Monday, and putting the spotlight on different leaders in our community that are taking a very clear stand. But for your work, for our community, thank you, and for your very clear understanding of justice and human rights, thank you. And I appreciate you taking the time to be here. And I found it very illuminating, and I appreciated what you brought up today. I thought you would bring up some interesting points. So that's good.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Forrest, as always.
It's always
being here with me.
Pleasure to serve and to support people. So thanks for the opportunity, Gina. Frank, thank you so much for being here. You know, I know so many people respect your organization too, at Cause. It's a very well respected, widely
strong voice.
So thank you for everything you do there to help make it what it is. And you know, I just want to say that this broadcast is hosted by the Santa Barbara Response Network, and I just want to let everyone know how you can learn more about it, which is at www.sbresponsenetwork.org. And one of the primary things that the network does is provide psychological first aid to people who may need it for any number of circumstances they may be navigating through or experiencing. So sbresponsenetwork.org, and you can also apply to actually provide psychological first aid as a volunteer or just to receive it. So check out the website. And if you two feel like this conversation is complete, then we could go ahead and conclude for the day.
And just to end it with one last note, I apologize, but if folks can go on Facebook, they can go to Healing Justice, BLMSB, and there they can find a page that created by Surge Santa Barbara, showing up for racial justice, for people to donate to support the local efforts happening, and to support Black leadership here in Santa Barbara. So folks can go there to donate. That's another action step.
Absolutely.
Oh, good. Say that again, the website again, Frank, and we'll put it on our website.
Yeah, it's on Facebook, and it's Healing Justice, BLMSB.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, very well. Thanks so much for sharing. So thank you both for being here, and thank you to our audience, and we will see you on Monday at the next Compassion Center of the Santa Barbara.
And our Spanish Facebook goes on the other days that our English isn't here. So it's every day, 5 o'clock. So
yeah, Spanish Tuesdays, English Monday, Wednesday. So be well, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.